So people often ask me if I'm the child of Holocaust survivors or the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, because a lot of times people who write novels about that period have that experience in their own families, which I don't.
Welcome to Story Power, a bi-monthly podcast where my guests and I geek out about the stories we're passionate about in all different genres, styles, and formats. My name is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden, and I started this podcast in the summer of 2020 at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. As I watched the reaction of my friends, family, and social media circle, I noticed that many people turned to stories for comfort and help in making sense of the craziness going on around them. My goal was to do the same for my listeners, but as I chatted with my guests throughout the first year, I discovered that their personal stories were the most fascinating thing about each episode. Neil Gaiman says, fairy tales are more than true not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. I now know that sharing our experiences with others helps us defeat our own dragons. It is our stories that connect us to one another. Let's see what wisdom today's guest has to share with us. Today, I'm talking to Sharon Hart-Green, and this is episode 45. And Sharon, you are an author. I was looking at your LinkedIn profile. You're also a professor. And so I was wanting to know about your book and what you teach. And I also see that you were involved in editing and publishing, and that your book was chosen for the Historical Novel Society. And
Yes.
so I want you to tell about that, all of those.
Okay. Now, where should I start?
Well, tell about your book first. I'm interested in that.
Yes. Okay. Well, it's a novel, and it's called Come Back for Me. And it was published in 2017 as it's been out for a few years, although that was in its hardcover or paperback version. It came out a few years later as an ebook, so now it's available as both. It's published by the University of Toronto Press, although the University of Toronto Press has an imprint called the New Jewish Press. So it's part of the New Jewish Press, which is part of the larger U of T press. Now, the book is what I would call a post-Holocaust novel. Some people consider it a Holocaust novel because it deals with war and it deals with the plight of survivors. But really, 95% of the novel is post-war. And what I tried to do in the novel is paint a portrait of survivors and the children of survivors and the kinds of struggles they have following the war. So the novel follows the trajectory of two completely different individuals. One is a young Hungarian, he's actually still a teenager, who survives the war and goes in search of his sister. They were separated during the war, and he's convinced she's still alive. So he goes on a journey looking for her. And the other story is about a young girl in Toronto, actually a young Canadian teenager in the 1960s, who comes from a family of Holocaust survivors. And their two stories eventually come together. I'm not going to say how and why, because that would give a little bit too much away, but their stories do come together eventually towards the end of the book. And you see how their experiences have some overlaps, even though you'd think that they wouldn't, because they come from completely different generations, but they do have some issues in common. And it's also a love story. It's a love story on the part of both of them separately. And it's also a coming of age story as well for both of them.
Yes. Oh, wow. That sounds really good. I wish I had gotten it before we chatted. I published a book independently in 2017 also.
Oh, really? Same year?
Yes. And it's partly historical as well. It has two timelines. There's a woman in the present who has this traumatic events happen in her life. And she finds the journals of her 3 times great grandmother who traveled from Vermont to Oregon to be a teacher on the Oregon Trail. So I grew up in Portland, Oregon, part of my life at the end of the Oregon Trail, and am the descendant of people
Pioneers.
who traveled on the Oregon Trail.
Interesting.
So I had fun doing the research on that, but having 2 timelines made it pretty long. So,
well, mine isn't that long. Mine, I'm not sure if you did it in this way. Mine has each one in alternate chapters. So it starts with one and then it goes to the other story and then back and forth. But they each progress at a similar pace.
That's neat.
And they are interwoven stories.
So do you teach history? I know that you teach at the University of Toronto.
I actually haven't been teaching for the last number of years. I took time off from teaching a few years ago to finish the novel. I had been working on it for a long time, and I decided I just needed time off. And I had been teaching at the university for 20 odd years.
Oh, wow.
But it was always on a part-time basis. So I decided to take time off, and I actually haven't gone back because I've enjoyed the writing so much that I decided to dedicate myself to writing, and I'm now writing a second novel. So I'm really following a new course in my life, and I put the teaching aside. I loved it at the time, and I was actually not teaching history. I was teaching literature. I was teaching modern Hebrew and Yiddish literature.
Oh, that's cool.
I started with Yiddish literature. That was what they needed taught at University of Toronto at the time when I got my doctorate at Brandeis in Boston. So I was living in Boston. When I came back from Boston to Toronto, I'm from Toronto originally. When I came back, they were looking for someone to teach Yiddish literature, and I got the job. So I taught that for a number of years. But my real field of specialization was Hebrew literature. So at a certain point, that's what was needed at the university. They were looking for someone to teach that. So I shifted into a different department and taught Hebrew literature for quite a few years. So I really enjoyed it. Most of my teaching was with small groups of students in seminar-like situations, and it was great. It was very intimate, and we did a lot of close reading of primary texts. It was really enjoyable. But, I taught basically the same cycle of courses over 20 years. And after a while, I just decided I needed something new. And part of it was I really wanted to finish this book because I felt that somehow the writing of fiction for me was so much more fulfilling and on other levels, because I had been teaching literature and I felt that I wanted to be producing the material that I was teaching, that I like teaching other people's writing, but at a certain point, I felt like I would like to be producing it rather than just teaching it. And so that's what I did. I finally finished the novel, and it was very satisfying. Although the process of getting published is a whole other thing. That takes a lot of work and a lot of time. Getting an agent, getting published, it's pretty onerous.
Oh, yes, really. And when I published mine, I was 65 or 6. And I just said, I don't want to wait 3 or 4 years to get my book published. So my husband and I did it independently.
Yeah, a lot of people decide to do that. I was getting close to that too, but then I did get a publisher and it all worked out. But, it takes a long time.
Well, I was talking to Moshe Mikanovsky, who lives in Toronto too.
Oh, yes. Yes, I know Moshe Mikanovsky.
Yes. Oh, you do? Oh, great.
Yes.
I'm having him be a guest again on December 1st, talking about Hanukkah. So,
nice.
Yeah. I was talking to Moshe about that, and he was telling me about he's published his book through a hybrid publisher.
Yes. That's a whole other model. Yes.
Yes. And I thought maybe I'll do that for my second book, because I do have a sequel to The Space Between Time, where the woman in the past becomes a part of the suffrage movement. And when I first started writing it, Jenna in the present didn't have anything to do because it was before the Me Too movement and all the political stuff that came after that. And
Right.
so, but now I have something for her to do. So,
Right. You have a new book to write.
yeah.
Yes.
But this podcast has sort of taken over my life. I started it in July of 2020. And in a way, I love it because I love talking about stories with people, but I also have discovered that I love hearing about their life stories. And
Yes.
so
Yes.
sometimes the way to get into talking about their life story is to find out what stories they love and,
Yes.
that kind of thing. I always have to credit the two women that I talked to, part of the Douglas Oral History Project, for making me realize, oh, everybody's a living library.
Yes.
And so all of the things that we love and all of the things that we have experienced are important to be recorded. And so that's sort of changed the trajectory a little bit of my podcast these last few months. But I love talking to authors and talking about their process. I love talking to musicians and artists and talking about their process too, because I love science. I love watching Nat Geo and all of those PBS Nature and, all of those things. But my brain doesn't really work that way. Well, I don't want to say I'm not logical, but I kind of really believe that the cognitive scientist that I quote is right, that humans are made to understand story, not logic.
Certainly,
Me.
it's a different type of understanding. It
Mhm, mhm,
really appeals to another level in the human brain or the human emotion.
mhm,
When you can read a book of history, which is, often chronological and fact based, and then you can read about the same period in a novel,
mhm,
and and you hear about characters and experiencing the same events,
mhm.
and it's filtered so differently in your brain and your
Right.
emotions. It enters and exits very differently.
Yes, and it makes you think of things in a completely different way. Like I remember when I read The Book Thief, and
Yes.
it was all those people, all those German people, some of them didn't want to be part of the Nazi party,
Right.
but what do you do? I mean, you've
Yes.
got to survive somehow. And so it was a new perspective. It was a
Yes,
new perspective.
definitely, because you're dealing with individuals rather than
Right.
events, impersonal events.
Right. Yes. So I'm really excited to read your book. So, and I
Oh,
want to read Moshe's book too, but it's not out quite yet. So,
yes, no, his hasn't come out yet. I think soon, but not yet.
yes. So I'm kind of where you are. This is my 14th year of teaching part-time at the college. And
Yes.
before that, I taught 10 years high school, both long-term subbing and then I got my master's in education and taught drama and English.
Mm,
And so I love what you said about history because I was teaching American Lit. And
yes.
a lot of the things early on in the year we were reading things that started the United States. We were reading the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and things that were written by Benjamin Franklin. And the kids were like, why do we have to read this stuff? We're learning this stuff in history. And I said, well, everything that's written down has a purpose. There's a
Yes.
reason why it was written down. And it kind of gives you a way into what the person was thinking when they were
Yes.
writing it.
Yes.
And so that's why we are looking at the documents
Yes.
of
Which is important. It's a very important.
yeah. And when I couched it that way, they went, oh, okay. It was okay then.
Yes.
Um,
Gave them a
so
different perspective on it.
right. Yeah. Well, and we did the History Channel, I think, did this really great documentary about Benjamin Franklin. And so I showed that in the class and we talked about some of not just him, but some of the other founding fathers and, what their lives were like and their attitudes and, Okay, so Thomas Jefferson said he was going to free his slaves, but he didn't. Well, why? Well,
Yes.
why do you think that was?
Yes. Yes, I remember seeing an excellent series on, I guess it was PBS, on John Adams. I don't know if you saw that one.
Yes.
It really brought John Adams to life. I thought, I feel like I now have an appreciation for who he was, what he contributed.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think it's funny. I read or saw something about him, and he was considered, at the time that he was alive, he was considered the other Adams. Samuel Adams was the more famous Adams. And now Samuel Adams is a beer.
Yes.
Yes. And John Adams and Abigail too,
yes,
are really the more prominent ones that we remember.
Right. And I think that series really is somewhat responsible for that.
Mm-hmm. So what is your second novel about? Is it a sequel?
No, it's not a sequel. It's about a completely different individual. It's about a young man who, it's also a coming of age story, but it's not post-war. It takes place in the 50s and 60s, about a young man who comes from a dysfunctional family, has a lot of conflicts with his brother and his parents, and leaves home to find his way in the world and seeks love. But he is plagued by a poetic disposition. And I say plagued because he can't seem to help himself, that he's always writing poetry, but he dislikes the fact that he has this poetic side to him, and he resists it. So that's part of his own interior struggle, internal struggle, and his attempts to find love and to find some way of reconciling himself with the damage done to him in his own family.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds interesting too.
So but that's not finished yet. That's about 2/3, 3/4 finished that book.
Yeah. Do you have beta readers, or do you have people that you give your manuscript to at certain points to help you, or do you just do it all yourself and then you have an editor who helps you?
Well, for the first book, I do have a friend who's a writer, and she reads my work and gives me feedback, and she's got a great eye, and she really offers great feedback. My husband also looks at it. He's a professor, and he's himself very knowledgeable and has a good eye. And then I have an agent who will read my material as well and give me feedback. So I have different levels of, I might ask a few other people for this new novel, because I've been helping a few other writers by offering feedback. So we'll do a little bit of an exchange. So I might be doing that with this novel. I haven't done it yet, but I probably will. I think it's incredibly important to do that, though, to get feedback, because you often cannot see the flaws in your own writing.
Right.
There are often plot holes or parts that don't really resonate with the reader, and you can't see it yourself. You're too close to it. And I find when I get the feedback, I generally know whether it's right or not. Sometimes you get a criticism from someone and you say to yourself, no, that's not right. That works, and I'm fine with it. But most of the time I find the feedback is right on. And then I find ways of incorporating it. And it usually enriches the novel. I tend to be a fairly terse writer. I'm not someone who has an overabundance of language in my writing. I tend to write in a very spare way, and sometimes to my own detriment, because I often need to give a bit more. I edit and edit and edit as I write. That's just the way I do it. I write a piece and then I work on it and polish it. But sometimes I take out too much. And then I'm left with almost too little, and then I have to add more. And that's probably the biggest thing I have to learn, is to give a little more from the beginning. So show a little bit more about, let's say, the atmosphere, the internal feelings, the the environment. Sometimes I'm a bit too spare. So that's the kind of thing that I find a better reader often picks up on.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so great. Yes, I had a couple of women who helped me with the space between time, and I just loved their feedback. They always gave me feedback that would spur my thinking. And then I go, oh, because they wouldn't really make suggestions. They would just say, this part, you need to write more here about this thing. Or, but I tend to be too wordy. But, we need a connection between this thing that happened and this thing that happened. They'd say that. And I then, when I was driving home after having lunch with them and talking about it, I would get ideas. And so I'd fix it and then I'd have them read it again. But unfortunately, both of them have died. And so just recently I know, really, one of them it was totally unexpected and sudden, but I was very, it was like, oh, shoot, now what do I do? Because I need somebody who can have the sort of the same genre that they write. I do have a couple of friends that I met on Facebook and interviewed on Story Power, and they both write fantasy. I would love to write fantasy, but right now I'm writing something else. And I need, and
that's a different genre.
Yeah, and they do, and they are like story partners. So they hold each other accountable for writing. Wow. And I love that whole idea. And then of course they read each other's work and make comments. And so I said, I kind of need a writing partner because I've tried writing groups, but one of them got so large, I couldn't keep up with reading everybody's stuff and working on my own. Yes. Mm-hmm. So I had to quit that group. And so if I have just like a writing partner, that's
I've never done that. I don't know if I would, I'm not sure if that would work for me, maybe because I find that I need my own schedule. I don't know if I could be on someone else's schedule, but everyone's different.
Well,
for one person, that's great.
Yeah, we wouldn't have to be on the phone at the same time, but I could send this person parts of what I'd been writing.
Yeah, like a few paragraphs or something. Yes.
Right. Or a chapter or something.
Yes.
And then she or he, we could exchange.
Right. Yes. No, I can see that working.
Yeah. And so I'm getting to the point where I'm really ready to stop teaching so that I have more time for my blog and my podcast and my writing.
It's time consuming and all the marking and, it just takes a lot of time. Well, I actually started in theater as well.
Oh,
we have that in common, actually. I mean, I didn't stay in it very long, but I do have some theater background.
Yes.
But it was many years ago when I was just a teenager. I was in acting and musical theater in Toronto.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So, but I didn't stay in it too long. It just, I didn't feel that I was good enough. I felt that I was pretty good, but I wasn't great. You know how it is when you know that you see others that you feel are incredibly talented and you're working with them and you think, okay, I'm okay, but I'll never be like that. And
right.
So, yeah, I ended up not staying, but.
Yeah, I mean, I did, when we lived in Portland, Oregon, that's where I got my master's at Portland State. I got involved in the theater scene there, but for me, it was semi-professional theater. All of the rehearsals were at night. My husband and I were like two ships passing in the night. He'd kiss me in the morning. I'd get home at 11:30 or midnight and he'd be in bed. I mean, we had maybe 45 minutes at dinner time.
Wow.
And I said, I think I want to put more time into my marriage. So So I stopped doing that. And I was teaching through Parks and Rec, Portland and Vancouver Parks and Rec departments, little kids, um,
Yes.
or some of them were middle school, some of them were homeschooled. And so I was doing that kind of thing. But yeah, eventually I just had to stop. And then when we moved to Arizona, I got to teach. And it
Yes.
was like, oh, perfect.
Yes. You're able to use your skills in a new way.
Yeah. Well, do you have any recommendations? Do you have any recommendations of books that you've read recently or stories that you want to share with our listeners?
Okay. Well, I have certain writers that I tend to read that I like very much. I like the novels of Elizabeth Strout.
Oh.
I don't know if you've read any of her novels,
No.
but I really like her writing. I just, in fact, read her first novel. I started with Olive Kitteridge, which is her very well-known novel and it ended up being made into a miniseries, which I didn't even like the miniseries, but the novel was very good. But Amy and Elizabeth was her very first novel, and I just finished it, and I thought it was really, really moving. I like the way she captures character and interrelationships. And this one is about a mother and a daughter. And I found that it extremely poignant. And she also tells a good story. It's a mixture of good characterization, but not at the expense of plot, because it has quite a bit of plot rather than only characterization. There's some stories that are just all about the character and there's not much happens. Whereas I like something to happen. I like to have a plot that I'm involved in, but also that where the characters are compelling.
Right. Yeah.
So that's one writer that I like very much. I also like Jhumpa Lahiri. I don't know if you've read anything by her. She's an Indian American writer.
That sounds familiar.
I've read, she tends to write short stories, but there are a number of novels that she's read that she's written as well. I'm trying to think of some of the others these are just writers that I have read very recently. There are other writers that, I go back to time and time again, classic writers like Jane Austen. Read all of Jane Austen's novels, and I never tire of them. I can read them over and over again.
I know.
She's a master of literary form, of characterization, of plot. She just brings all the elements together in such perfect harmony. So I love Jane Austen. I also enjoy Dickens. And again, great plots and characters, but it's completely different stylistically than Jane Austen. A lot of Russian literature that I enjoy.
Oh, wow.
I started very young to read Dostoevsky. I was still, I think, about 18 or 19 when I started reading his novels. And recently I went back and read a few that I hadn't read before. And Tolstoy. I finally read War and Peace after thinking that I wanted to read it for 20 years and I hadn't done it because it was so formidable in size. But I decided I was going to do it, and I did it, and it was really magnificent. So, Flaubert, Balzac, some of the classic European writers I'm very fond of. So, I tend to try to read widely. I'm very interested in Jewish literature and Hebrew and Yiddish literature and American Jewish literature, Canadian Jewish literature. I tend to read a lot of that as well, but I don't want to confine myself only to Jewish literature. So I like to branch out and try a lot of different writers. And I have to say, for all of those that I like, there are probably 10 that I start and put down. A lot of writing, I get a book out of the library or I buy it and I start it and I just can't get into it. I close it, put it down, because I don't want to spend time struggling through writing that I don't really enjoy.
Yes.
One of the main things I look for is one character in the novel that has some sort of inner nobility. I find it very difficult to read a story where I dislike every single one of the characters. If I dislike them all, I can't continue. I have to be emotionally invested in one character at least, maybe more than one, but at least one character has to have something higher. And if they do, then I will continue reading.
Right. I'm trying to think of the J.K. Rowling book that I read. I didn't like any of the characters except for the person who had died.
Okay.
It was the one about where they had somebody died and they had to elect a new city official. I cannot think of the name of it, but I'll put it in the show notes.
I haven't read it, so yeah.
And but I kept reading it because there were so many important things about it. Like it showed the difference between the middle class people in the town and the lower class. It showed why the lower class people did things like sell drugs or get involved in drugs.
Right.
It wasn't
just a social commentary that was interesting.
Yes, right. And I'm so glad that I read it, but there weren't very many. The person who died was the most likable character.
Right.
So I was glad that I read it because it did give me a new perspective, because even though it was set in England, it could have taken place someplace here in the United States,
Right. It wasn't place specific.
Right. Yes.
It could have been anywhere.
The issues were not places specific. Yes. So, of course, they had to have that special election, which I suppose they would have had to do something like that in the United States too. And it was about, all the political wrangling between the people in the town, among the people in the town. There wasn't one character that I did kind of like, and that was the doctor. She was a close friend of the person who died, and I did like her. But most of them were like, oh my goodness! If I lived in that town, I think I'd move. Oh, and there were some tragic things that happened, and it was because of this, economic disparity in the town. So, but I don't do that very often. And I was looking at my nightstand, and Eleanor has been sitting there since January. I started it came out at the end of last year. It's a nonfiction novel about Eleanor Roosevelt. Someone I admire very much, but I started reading it, and I know it's nonfiction, but it's kind of boring. And it's been sitting on my nightstand. I haven't gotten very far because it's like, oh my goodness.
Yeah. Like, you just don't feel like reading it. I know it's like a chore. I've had that experience. Sometimes I do find if I persist, it gets better.
Right.
That's actually what happened to me with War and Peace. I found that the beginning did not really do it for me. Mm-hmm. And I found that I tried a few times and I kept putting it down. And then my husband, who has read it a few times, kept saying, just keep going, push yourself, because it gets really good. And I did. And he was right. I had to get over that hump. It was almost as if there was, I don't know, there were a lot of characters and I didn't quite know who was who. And you didn't feel connected to any of them. And I didn't really feel like going back and reading it because it didn't have personal meaning to me. But then when I got over the hump and started to know certain particular characters, then I got involved in it. And then I read the whole thing. And I'm happy I did. But I had to give myself the opportunity to persist. I don't always do that. Sometimes I just become impatient and I say, no, I don't want to do this. And I
Well, I'm glad that you said that, because that is a book that I have kind of had on my TBR, not really officially, for a long time. But now that I know that, it reminds me of Middlemarch, because Middlemarch was like that.
Yes, that's true.
The whole first third of the book is setting up the characters and their relationships, and how, even how long they've lived in the town, and the doctor, why did the doctor move to the town? I mean, and it's like, when are we going to get to the story? But once the story
starts very late, but it becomes fabulous. I mean, it's a great novel.
Yeah. And
once you get into it.
Yeah. And you need all of that background information that she gives in that first part of the novel to make the rest of the novel meaningful.
Yes. Yes. And George
So,
Eliot does tend to be quite long-winded. So you have to get used to that
yes.
style. It's
Yes.
my husband and I often say it's when people didn't have any other sources of entertainment,
Right.
that they had more patience. So
Right.
you'd put up with all the
Mhm.
wordiness of a George Eliot novel. Now
Right.
people would find it very hard to do.
Oh, yeah. I didn't find I also read Daniel Deronda.
Yes.
I saw the miniseries or whatever it was
Yes.
with Hugh Dancy in it, and I loved it, and so I went and got the novel, and it was not quite the same format. I mean, yes, we did
Yes,
have to
it's
get
quite different than the miniseries. Yes.
yeah, and I love the other thing I loved about it is that the Jewish people were people, and the way the Christian people and the Jewish people interacted with each other was not, they weren't the Christian people can sometimes be condescending. I'm speaking as somebody who grew up Christian. They could be condescending, to the Jewish people. And sometimes that's the way it is in some of those older novels, but it wasn't like that at all. And I
No,
like,
no. It
yeah,
was very, very different in that way. No, that she did
yeah.
an amazing job with that novel.
Yeah. And I love that it was an awakening,
Yes,
for Daniel Deronda. So I could read that one again. That was really good. I like
yes. Yeah, that's another one of my favorites.
Yeah, I think I've read Silas Marner too. I think we read that in high school. I read that in high school, but I have to read that one again because it was a long time ago.
Yes, yeah. If I've read that one, I read The Mill on the Floss, I think a long time ago, but
Oh, yeah, I haven't read that one yet. So, oh, wow, this has been so fun. Do you have anything else you want to say before we go?
well, a little bit more about what inspired me to write the novel.
Okay, yes.
Because people often ask me if I'm the child of Holocaust survivors or the
Mhm.
grandchild of Holocaust survivors, because a lot of times people who write novels about that period have that experience in their own families, which I don't
Mhm.
actually. My father was born in Canada,
Mhm.
although his parents were Eastern European, but he was born in Canada. My mother actually was born in Eastern Europe, but she came when she was very young.
Mhm.
She was just a baby.
Mhm.
So they weren't survivors, but I grew up among a lot of Holocaust survivors and their
Mhm.
children. In fact, my very best friend as a child was a child of Holocaust survivors. So I think that
Oh,
made a very deep impression on me as a
yes.
child. And I always had a lot of questions about them. How did they survive the war? And
Oh,
the people that did survive, how did they go on and live relatively normal lives? Because the people that I knew, had marriages and children and professions.
mhm.
They were people who lived on my street when I was growing up.
Mhm.
And I knew they had horrific stories in their background. One of my neighbors, everyone knew that she had been hidden in an attic, or no, it wasn't an attic, it was a closet. She had been hidden in a closet in Holland for a number of years.
Oh my
Can you imagine?
goodness.
But this is someone who was married, had two children. I knew her son. I guess I always wondered, how do these people survive those sorts of experiences in ways that other people couldn't? Because there are some people that really did
Right,
not survive well. There were
right.
suicides after the war. There were people that just couldn't go on after losing entire families.
Oh,
I
yeah.
have a few distant relatives who had those experiences.
Mhm.
A great uncle who lost his family in the war, but they were people I didn't know too well. So I don't consider myself as having come from a survivor family
Mhm.
because they were very distant relatives, although my grandfather's parents and sisters were killed in Europe. But he never talked about them, and I really didn't know them at all, but I know that they were. But a lot of these children of Holocaust survivors, what made them very different was that they had no relatives. I had grandparents and cousins. I had tons of
Yeah,
cousins because my parents, they were here from childhood. And so
right.
they had siblings and aunts and uncles. The Holocaust survivor children tended to have no family. They had parents, and that's pretty well it. Sometimes they would have one uncle or aunt, They usually didn't have
Mhm.
grandparents. They usually didn't have many cousins, if any. And so one thing that I've noticed about them also is that they stick together, that they're not related necessarily, that these children often find other children of Holocaust survivors. They attract each other like magnets.
Mhm.
Well, that's just something that I've noticed. So all of these things, I guess, I were percolating in my mind probably from a very young age. And I
Yes.
was always very artistically inclined and, you know, wasn't someone who wrote a lot as a child, although I did do some writing. I was more involved in the arts, drawing,
Mhm.
painting, theater, all of that kind of thing.
Mhm.
But when I started teaching literature and got my doctorate and started teaching literature, it was as if those stories that I had accumulated as a child needed somehow release.
Yes.
And so I drew upon them, and it was almost like a mission. I felt that I had to understand what made those people tick
Right.
and why did some survivors do better than others. What was the formula? Was there a magic formula for
Right.
surviving better? And the question isn't even about what happened to them in the war. It's about any kind of trauma,
Right.
anything that traumatizes people and makes them feel helpless and unable to go on. Why is it some people cope better than others? Really,
Yeah.
that was my question when I wrote this book. And I tried to answer it, tentatively, of course. I don't have
Right.
all the answers for sure, but just by studying people and thinking about these questions, I try to come to some conclusions by portraying these different types in my novel.
Oh, wow. That's so interesting.
So I guess that's what I really wanted to
Yeah.
say about it, because that's really, I think, one of the most important elements in my novel.
Yes. Because I mean, why are some people so devastated with PTSD and it makes their lives so hard, and other ones they might have some PTSD symptoms, but they somehow manage to do a measure of healing so that
Yeah.
they can move on.
Yes.
Right.
And why is that? What is it that
Right.
what are those elements? Is it just an inborn trait, or are there things that people do that change the outcome?
Right. Oh yeah. Oh,
Those are
that's
the kinds of things I've been thinking about.
yes. Oh my gosh, really? That's so interesting. Now, I forgot to ask you at the outset before we go. Do you have a website for your
I
book?
do. Yes, I
Oh,
do.
so send me that
I will.
information.
I
And
do.
and then
I will.
because I will put that in the show notes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Yes,
Yeah.
the book is available, as I said, in
Mhm.
paperback and as an ebook,
Mhm.
and it's available in stores if the stores happen to carry it, and also
Mhm.
Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and all the usual
Right.
places.
Now, are you planning on doing an audiobook?
That's a good question. My publisher raised it with me, and I said I'd like to, but then she said that it's very expensive, and because it's a university press, they don't do too many, so they're thinking about it, but I don't know if they will or not.
Yeah.
I know sometimes authors can do them themselves with if they hire someone, they can put them together. I don't know if I would do that, though. I think I'd want it done professionally, so it's still to be discussed.
Yes.
I
Yes.
love audiobooks, though. Whenever I go on a car trip, I listen to them.
Oh
And I've
yeah.
heard a lot of very good ones. So I would love it to be an audiobook.
But yes, it is expensive. Yes. I was thinking of doing my own and I got about 15 chapters in and I said, I'm not a good enough actress to do the different voices.
I know it's hard. I don't think I could do my own. There's no way. I
Yeah.
just admire some of these expert readers, actors that do them. The good ones are phenomenal.
Yeah, really. They are. Well, I will put your social media and your website up on the show notes.
Okay.
And thank you so much for being my guest.
Oh, well, it was my pleasure. It was fun to chat and learn about you and to share some of our experiences in the world of writing.
That's right. Yes. We'll hopefully talk to you again soon.
Okay, well, that would be great. Thanks so much, Lucinda, for having me on.
hope you enjoyed the show. If you like what you heard, please share it with a friend and give us a review on your favorite podcast app. It will help people find us. You'll find the show notes for this episode at my website, Sage Woman Chronicles, at sagewoman.life. You can leave a comment there. And remember, as Philip Pullman said, after nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in the world. Until next time, this is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden. Thanks for listening.